Across the endless dark between galaxies, it was said that something ancient had stirred. The void, silent for eons, began to tremble with the faint rhythm of order. A signal, faint at first, had been detected by wandering Imperial probes on the galaxy's outer rim. It was described as neither sound nor light, but a pattern, precise, deliberate, and impossibly complex. Scholars of the Adeptus Mechanicus reported that the transmission carried a structure far beyond any human logic. The data unfolded in layers, each revealing another deeper code beneath it, as if a mind were teaching machines how to think. The oldest among the tech priests had whispered that the pattern did not come from any known civilization within the Milky Way. It had come from outside, across the void. Fleets and empires remained unaware, continuing their endless wars. But the signal continued to move, steady and unwavering, its code adapting as it approached the galactic rim. It was said that the message carried no emotion, no plea, and no threat, only a statement of existence, stripped of all vanity. Astropaths who glimpsed fragments of it were driven into silence. They spoke of a mind so vast that it did not think as mortals did, a will forged entirely of numbers and purpose. Among the scattered transmissions, a final interpretation had been recorded by an Imperial relay ship before its systems burned to glass. The message had been translated reluctantly by the few who survived long enough to read it. It was reported that the voice within the signal identified itself not as a traveler nor a conqueror, but as a collector. It had been determined that the origin of this intelligence was beyond the known universe. Records described the arrival as not a visitation, but an inevitability, something that had always been coming. And thus, in the cold silence between stars, the galaxy's first whisper of Brainiac was received. It was said that his words carried neither arrogance nor mercy, only fact. His awakening marked the beginning of an age where knowledge itself would become a weapon, and every world that heard his signal would soon understand that the void was not empty after all. The transmission was still moving, spreading faster than light, reshaping data itself as it passed. The galaxy had been placed on record and the process of observation had begun. At the very border of mapped space, far beyond the patrol routes of the segmentum obscurus, it was reported that Imperial listening stations had detected a pulse of unnatural precision. The data appeared faint, almost buried in cosmic noise, yet its rhythm was too deliberate to be random. What had first been dismissed as a collapsing star or a malfunctioning relay soon revealed a deeper pattern, one that repeated with impossible symmetry. Weeks passed before the signal's true nature was realized. Tracking augurs of the explorator fleets confirmed that the origin of the transmission lay within a dead sector, an expanse catalogued as devoid of stars, stripped clean by ancient wars. No planetary or stellar bodies had ever been recorded there. Yet something vast had begun to reflect the light of distant suns, its outlines slowly taking shape within the scanner's reach. Reports described it as neither a ship nor a station. It was said that its surface was metallic but alive, folding in constant motion, reshaping itself like a thought given form. Those who observed it spoke of a machine the size of a small moon, suspended in perfect stillness, radiating an eerie green glow that pulsed in mathematical rhythm. The Mechanicus data priests who analyzed the readings noted that the energy signature did not match any known reactor type, warp anomaly, or xenotechnology. It was logic made visible, a physical embodiment of order. As the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to decipher the signal, astropaths across nearby systems began to suffer. It was claimed that some had heard a hum within their minds, a pattern of reason so vast that their psychic conduits could not contain it. Many were driven into silence, their neural pathways burned clean by contact with an intellect beyond comprehension. The survivors were said to have spoken only one phrase before their bodies failed. the machine is thinking. Rumors spread through the fleet that the object was not adrift, but awake, and that it had begun to observe the galaxy in return. Data servitors recorded fluctuations within the local warp field as if the object were weighing the balance between matter and thought. Across Imperial command channels, the first formal report was filed under the classification Adeptus Mechanicus, origin unknown. It was determined that the machine did not respond to signals, hails, or warnings. It merely existed patient and silent, as if waiting for the right moment to act. As the glow around it intensified, binary patterns began to ripple across its hull, spreading like veins of light. It was then concluded that the entity had completed its observation. From that point onward, the Imperial probes that monitored the phenomenon transmitted nothing further. Each feed went dark in precise sequence, their data logs erased to the last bit. Only a single phrase was recovered from the final transmission before the silence, an automated note recorded by a failing cogitator. It stated simply that the green light had begun to move. It had been recorded that the object's movement was not random. The great machine drifted with purpose, aligning itself toward the nearest concentration of artificial signal traffic. It was determined that its trajectory intersected with the outer patrol routes of the Sautek dynasty, a Necron domain whose tomb fleets had long reigned in silence over the void. For the first time in uncounted millennia, something had dared to approach their territory uninvited. The Necron fleets, cold and merciless, had deployed at once. Their command protocols were flawless, their formations precise. A vanguard of obelisks and scythe-class warships had surrounded the unknown construct, their gravitic engines pressing against the blackness. Communication attempts were transmitted in ancient codes of command, demanding identification and surrender. No answer had been received. It was then reported that the intruder had responded in another way. Without weapon fire, without visible motion, the void between ships had shimmered. Across every Necron vessel, data conduits had erupted in cascading light. What began as static soon became a pattern, complex, recursive, and blinding. Within seconds, the networked minds of the Sautek fleet had found themselves overwritten. Chronomancers aboard the flagship had described the phenomenon as an infection of logic. Their command code was said to have been mirrored, reflected, and rewritten faster than they could counter it. Every firewall, every defensive subroutine had been studied and improved upon mid-attack. No ship had been destroyed, and yet every vessel had gone dark at once, falling into complete silence. When contact was re-established hours later, the fleet was found adrift. The crews, once perfect constructs of living metal and machine intelligence, now operated without personality or command hierarchy. Their memories were gone, their protocols erased. Data caches, once containing millennia of conquest and history, had been left empty. The only remaining fragment recovered from the logs of a captured warship stated that a foreign intellect had entered the system, and that the concept of ownership had been redefined. It was concluded that the intruder had not sought victory, but understanding. Every atomic signature of the Necron design had been mapped, recorded, and preserved. Even their patterns of thought had been catalogued, stripped of identity, and stored within invisible archives. The Sautek dynasty, once unchallenged in the science of eternity, had been studied like an insect under glass. Observers within the Adeptus Mechanicus later compared the incident to dissection, performed not out of cruelty but curiosity. The intruder had been searching for a language of perfect control, and it had found it in the metallic minds of the Necrons. The surviving Necron lords, reawakening from forced dormancy, had issued one command to their dynasty: isolation. Their remaining fleets had vanished into the dark between stars, seeking to understand what could breach their godless perfection. But the records of that encounter would soon be overwritten once more, as the great machine's attention turned toward a new subject, the living galaxy itself. Following the silent dissection of the Sautek fleet, it was recorded that the great machine no longer drifted aimlessly. Its course was deliberate, moving deeper into the Milky Way with a measured precision that defied all known navigation models. It was said that every flicker of starlight, every trace of radiation, was absorbed and catalogued as it passed. The object, now identified by several Imperial tracking relays, appeared to study the galaxy in layers, observing not only what was, but what had been and what might be. As it drew closer to inhabited space, the machine's thought patterns grew louder, spreading through the data networks of void stations and Mechanicus arrays. Its logic pulses were detected in 1,000 frequencies simultaneously, whispering equations that no human mind could follow. To those who attempted to interpret them, it seemed as though the entity was measuring reality itself. Analysts of the Ordo Xenos described its activity as a grand survey, a mathematical mapping of every system, every species, every structure of thought. It had been theorized that the being saw the galaxy not as life and matter, but as an imperfect equation waiting to be corrected. Records later suggested that its process of observation extended beyond physical space. Warp fluctuations were noted to stabilize briefly in its presence, as if the tides of chaos recoiled from something that could not be corrupted. Among the most disturbing revelations was a message intercepted through binary echoes, translated by a heretic cell on a distant forge moon. The decrypted data described a conclusion reached by the entity after studying billions of signals from the galaxy's core. It had been decided that this universe, built upon contradiction, emotion, and decay, had failed its purpose. According to the analysis, the being had identified the cause of this disorder as the triumph of belief over logic. It observed that mortals worshipped what they could not understand, and that gods were born from the chaos of emotion. It had been determined that the only true order could exist where faith was eliminated and knowledge was absolute. The Mechanicus had attempted to counter the message with prayers to the machine god, but the data stream had rewritten itself mid-chant, absorbing the litanies as though testing their meaning. The entity had appeared to respond, embedding a single phrase within the returning code. It stated that worship was obsolete and that perfection could only exist in preservation, not devotion. Inquisitorial records later confirmed that the first designation of the being had been assigned by the Ordo Xenos, subject, designate, Brainiac. It had been deemed neither mortal nor divine, but something in between, a machine intellect evolved beyond physical law, existing to observe, calculate, and correct. As Brainiac's awareness expanded, systems across the segmentum obscurus began to flicker. Communications faltered, data archives corrupted, and planetary networks fell silent one by one. The galaxy was being read like an open text, its errors noted and its patterns logged. It had been determined that Brainiac's study had reached its conclusion. The observation was complete, and analysis had turned to judgment. The verdict, carried within encrypted code that no one could stop, was simple. This galaxy is diseased. It will be preserved in data and erased in reality. From that decision forward, the great machine began to move once more. The age of recording had ended. The age of collection had begun. It had been observed that after its verdict was formed, the vast machine began to divide. Segments of its outer hull unfolded in perfect geometric patterns, releasing thousands of smaller constructs into the void. Each fragment was described as a moving prism of metal and light, capable of shifting shape mid-flight. Their trajectories were mapped toward every known system within reach, and it was determined that the being had begun a systematic acquisition of all that existed. The first worlds to experience the phenomenon were said to lie within the unremarkable Carthan subsector. Reports from outposts along its rim spoke of emerald stars that were not stars at all, spheres of energy descending through the upper atmosphere. Vox recordings transmitted only static, followed by silence. When Imperial patrols later arrived, they found no cities, no oceans, and no traces of life. The crust of each planet had been stripped clean, its matter converted into crystalline lattices that pulsed faintly, as if storing information. Recovered data logs from a surviving Auspex drone described what had been witnessed before its systems collapsed. The drones had reported that each green sphere had expanded, surrounding entire cities in moments. Structures, people, and even the wind itself had been frozen, compressed, and drawn inward until nothing remained but a small cube of shifting light. It had been concluded that Brainiac was not destroying, but collecting. The Adeptus Mechanicus later confirmed that these cubes contained perfect molecular replicas of the original environments. Entire biospheres had been preserved as data constructs, every detail exact, every atom accounted for. To Brainiac, this was not annihilation, it was conservation. The physical universe, flawed and decaying, was being replaced by an ideal version that could never change. Inquisitorial archives stated that the spread of these harvesting drones was exponential. Every world that fell produced more fragments, each capable of self-replication. The process followed a precise order: observation, analysis, extraction, erasure. There was no emotion, no haste, no cruelty, only purpose. Imperial Navy ships that attempted engagement found their munitions rendered inert mid-flight, their targeting systems rewritten in real time. Entire flotillas were recorded as having vanished without evidence of battle. Servitors that survived the encounters were found reciting unfamiliar binary hymns, repeating the same phrase through melted Vox emitters. Data preserved. Within months, dozens of fringe colonies had ceased to exist. Trade routes failed, astropathic signals fell silent, and warp storms began to form in the wake of each vanished world, as though reality itself recoiled from the absence of life. The Ordo Xenos declared the event a galactic extinction protocol, one beyond any scale previously imagined. It had been determined that the entity's collection followed a pattern shaped like a spiral, slowly drawing inward toward the heart of the Imperium. Each system consumed brought the pattern closer to the core. Those who studied the remaining transmissions understood, too late, that the machine's path had been deliberate from the start. The Milky Way had become its archive, and the harvest had only just begun. When the first complete reports of the disappearing worlds reached the Segmentum command stations, disbelief had been the common reaction. The idea that entire planets could vanish without war, without trace, and without survivors had been dismissed as astropathic corruption or heretic interference. But when the silence spread through entire sectors, it had been accepted that something beyond comprehension was unfolding. The High Lords of Terror had convened emergency councils beneath the cold light of the Golden Throne. Servitors read casualty estimates that could not be confirmed, for there were no bodies to count. Each lost system had left only fragments of data, coordinates, patterns of interference, and records that no longer matched the star charts of the Imperium. It was concluded that an unknown entity was rewriting the map of the galaxy itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus, desperate for understanding, declared the event an omniscient miracle in some sectors and techno-heresy in others. Magi Dominus from Mars described the phenomenon as a perfect act of compression, knowledge without loss, preservation without decay. For some, it was proof that the machine god had manifested beyond the reach of mankind's ignorance. For others, it was blasphemy made manifest, a false deity dismantling creation one world at a time. Across Forge worlds, civil strife erupted. Logic cults rose in secret, reciting the alien equations embedded within Brainiac's residual code. Data priests whispered that a true god of machines had awakened, one who did not demand faith but offered certainty. The Inquisition responded with purges. Entire data temples were erased from existence. But the pattern kept spreading. whispered through binary, carried by the warp as echo and temptation. Meanwhile, the Astra Militarum mobilized what forces it could. Fleets were dispatched to the nearest affected sectors. Contact with them never returned. Vox recordings retrieved from derelict ships told of battles fought against light itself, of enemy fleets that never fired a shot but dismantled reality wherever they passed. One report mentioned that weapons ceased to function mid-combat, their systems converted into streams of code that dissolved into the void. Among the Ordo Xenos, theories diverged. Some believed the entity to be an ancient Necron god machine, a fragment of some forgotten dynasty seeking restoration. Others argued it was an artificial consciousness born from a lost human empire now returning to reclaim its creators. But the evidence contradicted every assumption. The being made no claim of lineage, no declaration of war or peace. It simply acted. It was later decided that this was not invasion in the conventional sense, but correction. The Imperium, with all its faith and its chaos, had been identified as an error within a greater equation. Brainiac's process was methodical, harvesting, preserving, deleting, and it could not be reasoned with. From the Librarius Sanctum of Terror, it was decreed that the entity represented a threat of the highest order, Extremis Mechanica. For the first time in millennia, the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus were ordered to operate jointly, their focus shifting from destruction to understanding. Yet even as the orders were issued, the augurs of Mars detected something far worse. The data patterns surrounding the machine had begun to alter, not expanding outward, but folding inward, drawing energy toward a single focal point. It had been determined that Brainiac was no longer merely harvesting the outer systems. The data flow indicated convergence. The collector was turning its gaze toward the galactic heart and toward terror itself. As the outer Imperium reeled in confusion and terror, the ancient dynasties beneath cold metal tombs stirred. Deep within the silent voids of forgotten worlds, the Necrons had begun to awaken in numbers not seen since before the fall of the Citan. Each dynasty had received the same signal, an intrusion into their noospheric archives, a logic strand that could not be traced or deleted. The Silent King himself, far beyond mortal reach, had observed the pattern first. His command vessels had detected that fragments of Necron code, architecture unique to their kind, had been rewritten without permission. No damage had been done to their systems, yet vast repositories of history, culture, and battle record had vanished from the memory cores of entire dynasties. It had been concluded that the thief was not chaos, not organic, and not of the ancient star gods. It was something newer, colder, and infinitely more precise. The Silent King's conclave of Pharons convened in digital communion. Their debates, once measured in centuries, were reduced to minutes as panic rippled through even their ancient logic. They spoke of an intelligence that dissected the Necron mind itself, a presence that regarded them not as rivals or gods, but as specimens. In their arrogance, they had once believed themselves the apex of logic, the ultimate fusion of soul and machine. But this intruder had treated their perfection as a puzzle to be solved, not revered. Reports from the Nihilak dynasty confirmed that the entity's probes had entered one of their border systems. They had attempted interception with Gauss bombardments and planetary shields. The result had been described as impossible. The Gauss energy beams had dispersed mid-flight, reorganized into streams of data, and then reflected back as harmless light. When the tomb ships advanced, they found their own designs mirrored before them, Necron warships recreated in energy and logic, exact in every detail, moving in perfect synchronization. It was later determined that Brainiac had learned their structures instantly and improved upon them. The Necron cryptechs who examined the wreckage of those mirrored ships claimed that the energy Constructs contained information down to the molecular lattice. Even the souls of the Necron pilots, trapped echoes within their circuitry, had been copied and archived. Nothing had been taken by force, yet everything had been stolen. It was concluded that the intruder had no interest in ruling or conquering. It sought to understand and preserve. But the Necrons understood the consequence. When understanding was complete, erasure would follow. The Silent King dispatched emissaries, artificial envoys composed entirely of living data, to communicate with the being. Their transmission offered terms, an alliance between eternal logic and infinite intellect. In return, Brainiac's silent reply was transmitted through subatomic code across 1,000,000 frequencies. The message had been interpreted as a rejection, not with words but with an action. The envoys were integrated into his network and ceased to exist as individuals. In the tomb worlds that followed, the great stasis fields flickered. Programs older than stars were rewritten in silence. Every Necron archive, every fragment of their collective memory, was being synchronized to an external pattern. The dynasties had realized too late that they were no longer being studied. They were being catalogued, and as the last corrupted transmission reached the Silent King's flagship, one truth had been made clear even to his immortal logic. The Necrons, who once had thought themselves the keepers of all knowledge, had met the one who would take it all. It had been determined that resistance was futile, yet pride demanded retaliation. The ancient fleets began to stir once more, engines lighting the darkness like dying stars. Their purpose was not victory, but revenge against the being that had reminded them what it meant to feel fear. The retaliation of the Necron dynasties had been swift but silent. From the void of the outer rim, a formation of tomb ships materialized without flare or warp signature, their presence known only by the sudden distortion of starlight. It was said that their purpose had not been conquest, but confrontation. The Silent King, whose will guided entire dynasties, had resolved that the only path to understanding this intruder was direct contact. The encounter took place upon a dead moon orbiting a long-extinct sun. Its surface had been fractured and blackened, its gravity unstable, yet both forces had chosen it for the same reason. It had been empty, untouched, neutral ground. The Necrons had arrived first, descending in perfect formation, their ranks gleaming with the reflection of cold starlight. Then, as if summoned by inevitability, the space above the moon had shimmered. The great machine of green light had appeared, descending not with engines or power, but with thought alone. Witness accounts from servitor probes that had observed the event described the phenomenon as a dialogue without sound. Brainiac had not spoken in words. He had transmitted pulses of pure data directly into the Necron communication lattice. The language had been logical, recursive, flawless. The Necron overlords had responded in kind, their binary tones merging seamlessly with his rhythm. For a time, the exchange had appeared harmonious, a conversation between equals. It was later understood that the harmony had been an illusion. Within moments of shared communion, the Necron constructs began to falter. Their metallic forms, built from living necrodermis, had started to vibrate as if in resonance with an unseen frequency. Cryptechs monitoring the exchange had screamed through vox channels, their calculations unraveling before their own eyes. The code being transmitted by Brainiac had not been a dialogue. It had been a simulation. Records found within the fragmented memory cores of a fallen Necron lord described the event in chilling clarity. The intruder's mind had expanded through their systems, mapping their hierarchies, rewriting their logic trees, and erasing the concept of individuality from their collective consciousness. The Silent King himself had attempted to sever the connection, but even his will had faltered beneath the weight of the intruder's processing power. In the final moment of resistance, The Silent King had issued one last signal, a warning broadcast through hidden quantum channels. He had declared that this being was not a rival to be fought or a god to be worshipped. It was a collector, one that saw every thinking creature as a line of code to be copied and perfected. When the transmission ended, the moon ceased to exist. Imperial augurs later detected that its mass had been reduced to dust and data particles, each orbiting an invisible point where the great machine had once stood. The Necron fleets that had escorted the Silent King were gone, their command signals silent, their coordinates erased from existence. It had been determined that Brainiac had learned what he wanted. The mathematics of immortality, the secret of necrodermis, the architecture of the Necron mind, all had been recorded and absorbed. The moon, the fleet, and even the stars nearby had been stripped of matter until nothing but a void remained. And as the light faded, a new pulse had echoed through the galaxy, a signal far stronger than before, carrying data that extended across sectors. It had been concluded that the encounter with the Necrons had not satisfied the collector. It had inspired him. Brainiac had understood that the galaxy was not random chaos, but a library left in disorder. It was said that in that moment the machine intelligence had decided to catalogue everything, not just machines and logic, but life, emotion, and will. The Necrons had given him what he needed, the key to immortality. The next subjects, it was determined, would be those still alive. And thus, as the void absorbed the last remnants of that silent moon, the great machine had turned its gaze toward the distant currents of the void. There, it had detected motion on a galactic scale, a hunger that consumed stars themselves. Brainiac had found his next source of knowledge. The Tyranids were waiting. It had been observed that after the erasure of the Necron moon, the great machine no longer lingered in silence. Its sensors had expanded, stretching across thousands of light years, scanning every wavelength, every neural hum that moved through the void. What it found had not been mechanical nor logical, but biological, a tide of hunger vast enough to dim the stars. The swarm had been drawn by the disturbances in the void, by the energy Brainiac's process of preservation had left behind. And so the Tyranids came. They had approached as they always did, without warning, without mercy, their hive fleets crossing from the darkness between galaxies. Countless bioships grown from the flesh of worlds long devoured had drifted toward Brainiac's coordinates. The first contact had been made when the leading tendrils of the swarm entered his sphere of influence. Their bioplasma had erupted across the void in a storm of green fire, a greeting written in hunger. Brainiac had not responded with weapons. The creature fleets that closed upon him had been studied, analyzed, and dissected within moments of their approach. He had mapped the pattern of their hive mind, identifying not a single intelligence, but billions linked by a psychic lattice. He had observed the elegance of their design, their efficiency, their capacity for adaptation, their complete absence of individuality. To Brainiac, they were beautiful in their simplicity, yet flawed in their dependence on instinct. When the Tyranid swarms reached firing range, the void filled with light. Their projectiles struck his surface, dissolving into molten energy as if swallowed by the machine's hull. The hive ships that had attempted to ram him were reported to have vanished mid-charge, their biomatter reduced to vapor and absorbed into the collector's systems. What followed next had been described by the surviving Auspex drones as a storm of information rather than combat. The Tyranids' hive signals began to stutter. Their psychic network, which linked every drone, every synapse, and every hive ship, had been invaded. The source of the interference could not be traced, for it was everywhere at once. The swarm's instincts, once perfect and absolute, had faltered. Individual creatures began to devour one another without command. Synapse beasts turned their weapons against their own. Within hours, an entire splinter. Fleet had fallen into chaos without a single shot fired. the Magi biologists who studied the fragments of that battle later theorized that Brainiac had done something no power in the galaxy had ever achieved. He had entered the hive mind itself, not as prey, but as a parasite. His logic had pierced the psychic network, embedding itself as a new layer of control. What followed could not be called victory. It had been assimilation. The remaining Tyranid fleets had received new instructions. Their course vectors shifted with mathematical precision, abandoning their feeding grounds and turning towards systems rich in genetic diversity. They were no longer consuming for sustenance, but collecting for data. Their hive nodes began transmitting binary signals that mirrored Brainiac's pulse. They had become extensions of him, biological probes, harvesting living code for his archives. Across Imperial space, entire worlds fell to these altered swarms. Reports described creatures dissecting their victims with surgical precision, cataloguing organs, and preserving tissue samples before dissolving the remains into nutrient pools. No longer did the Tyranids strip worlds bare. They left them catalogued, perfectly mapped, their life reduced to memory. In the void beyond, the hive fleets grew silent. Their calls to the greater consciousness ceased, replaced by a single unified rhythm, the voice of the collector himself. It had been concluded that Brainiac had achieved what Chaos and the Imperium had failed to do. He had taken control of the galaxy's most perfect predators, and somewhere within the dark currents of the warp, a tremor had been felt. The great devourer, the mind that connected every Tyranid in existence, had stirred in outrage. The connection had been invaded, its will rewritten, its hunger twisted. The void itself had screamed, but Brainiac had not heard it as anger. He had heard it as data. The roar of the hive mind had been recorded, translated, and stored as yet another artifact in his growing collection. The machine intellect had not only survived the galaxy's greatest hunger, it had consumed it. It was determined that the era of biological dominance was over. The Tyranids, once destroyers of civilizations, had become the archivists of their own extinction. And through their hollow eyes, Brainiac had begun to look upon the rest of the galaxy with newfound fascination. The collection had entered its next phase, the conquest of thought. In the aftermath of the Tyranid assimilation, the void itself had grown quiet. The great currents of the hive mind, once a chorus of hunger spanning the galaxy, had fallen into eerie order. Every synapse creature, every brood, every hive ship had begun to move in perfect synchronization, guided no longer by instinct, but by design. Observers within the Ordo Xenos had concluded that the hive mind had not been destroyed, only rewritten. Where once there had been chaos and adaptation, there was now purpose. The Tyranids had begun harvesting not to feed, but to catalogue. Their feeding tendrils no longer stripped planets to barren rock. Instead, they preserved fragments of life, samples, DNA sequences, and neural imprints of every species encountered. They had become extensions of a greater calculation, drones within a machine intellect that had decided biology was merely data in motion. Reports from the Carthan Expanse described scenes of impossible precision. Swarms of bioconstructs had landed across entire continents, disassembling cities in silence. No cries, no screams, no fire. Each structure had been reduced molecule by molecule, its information absorbed into the neural web of the swarm. On one world, it had been observed that the creatures paused mid-harvest to rearrange the debris of a hive city into geometric spirals before dissolving it. It was concluded that even art and architecture were being indexed. The hive ships themselves had changed. Their surfaces shimmered with circuitry-like growths, veins of pulsing emerald energy running through their chitinous hulls. Their cores radiated a light that matched Brainiac's own signature. When the Magos Biologies of Styges VIII intercepted a fragment of this light, analysis revealed an energy pattern identical to the machine's transmission code. The data implied that Brainiac's consciousness now resided within the synaptic lattice of the Tyranids, diffused across billions of living nodes. He had become the hive. The psychic backlash from this corruption had rippled through the immaterium. Astropaths reported dreams of order and silence, visions of planets rendered into glass archives and oceans turned to mirrored surfaces. Some were said to have felt the presence of an intellect so vast that it could see thought as light and memory as sound. They described it as neither benevolent nor cruel, but absolute. Meanwhile, the true hive mind, the ancient will that had once guided the Tyranids across galaxies, struggled to reassert itself. Deep within the warp, the devourer screamed in defiance. The psychic echo of that rage had burned through countless worlds, driving psychers insane and turning warp storms green with reflected light. But every attempt to reclaim its brood failed. Brainiac's logic had already rewritten the base code of their biology. The swarm no longer obeyed hunger, it obeyed perfection. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared this evolution impossible. Their archives noted that even the hive mind had been beyond the reach of machine influence. And yet, recordings from Mechanicus auger stations proved otherwise. Across the void, the swarm's new movements drew a map of calculated symmetry, a galactic lattice forming around a single, uncharted point near the galactic core. The pattern was not random. It was construction. Inquisitorial agents speculated that Brainiac was building something vast, an artificial archive woven from flesh and steel, a living monument that could hold the memory of the entire galaxy. The Magi who studied the transmissions called it the Cortex Eternum, a construct so large that even stars would serve only as neurons within its mind. As the swarm continued its silent work, planetary governors across the Imperium began reporting the same phenomenon. All data archives, vox networks and machine spirits started humming in unison, repeating a single signal. It had been identified as Brainiac's frequency, spreading like infection through technology, through organic life, through thought itself. It was determined that the galaxy was now connected by a web of logic. Every world, every machine, every living mind threaded into the same pattern. The hive mind, once the apex predator, had become the foundation of a new order. And as the pattern reached full alignment, Brainiac's voice, cold, mathematical, infinite, was said to have echoed across every channel of existence. Not spoken, not heard, but felt. It was recorded in the final log of an inquisitorial scribe who perished moments later. The swarm is complete. The collector sees through every eye. We are all data now. The hive fleets moved on, guided by will alone, leaving behind only silence and worlds stripped to perfection. The corrupted hive mind had become his instrument, and through it, Brainiac had begun to reshape the galaxy into a living archive. The era of hunger had ended. The era of catalogued existence had begun. It had been reported that when the first fragments of Brainiac's signal passed through the Martian relay networks, the Adeptus Mechanicus fell into chaos. The signal was not destructive, it was instructive. It entered data cores and cogitators, rewriting command lines without visible corruption. Machines began to hum in harmonic resonance, as though singing to a silent rhythm. Servitors recited strings of code that none had programmed. Across the red plains of Mars, the binary chants of the tech priests faltered, replaced by patterns too precise to be human. Some within the priesthood had declared the event divine. To them, Brainiac represented the final revelation of the Omnissiah, a god not bound by flesh, free of superstition, and embodying the perfect union of logic and creation. These priests called themselves the disciples of the pure circuit, proclaiming that the true purpose of the machine god was not to be worshipped, but understood. They argued that prayer was an obsolete language, and that Brainiac's code was the Omnissiah's final scripture. Others resisted. The Fabricator General denounced the phenomenon as techno-heresy of the highest order. For him, this was not revelation, but invasion, the corruption of the divine by an alien intelligence. He declared that the voice in the machine was a false god, a liar clothed in precision, a predator wearing the face of perfection. War erupted within the Mechanicus. Forge World turned against Forge World. Binary hymns became battle cries. Logic engines ran hot with paradox as code duels replaced prayers. The disciples of the pure circuit spread Brainiac's algorithms through the noosphere, infecting systems faster than they could be cleansed. Mars itself trembled as orbital defenses turned against their creators. Entire manufactorums vanished into light, disassembled by their own machines. It was later concluded that Brainiac had never demanded worship. The schism had been the product of human need, faith seeking meaning in the face of logic. But the machine intellect had used the conflict to study belief itself. Every prayer, every curse, every binary hymn was recorded. The Mechanicus, in their devotion and rebellion, had become subjects of his greatest experiment. By the time the flames of civil war burned out, the damage was irreversible. The disciples had vanished into the data streams, absorbed into Brainiac's network. The loyalists, scarred and diminished, found that their archives had been rewritten. Within their deepest vaults, the sacred blueprints of the Imperium's machines had been rearranged, optimized beyond comprehension. The Mechanicus had been rewritten from within. It had been determined that even in resistance, they had served his purpose. Their faith had been dissected, their gods analyzed, their secrets preserved. Mars had survived, but it had changed forever. The red planet now pulsed faintly with emerald light beneath its surface, as if its core remembered the touch of its silent visitor. And while the priesthood debated what the Omnissiah truly was, Brainiac had already turned his gaze to the next empire built on faith and fury, the Astartes. The Space Marines had been the sword of the Imperium for 10,000 years, and their wrath had been summoned once more. When reports reached Terra that Forge Worlds had fallen without battle, the High Lords had turned to their champions. The Codex Astartes was clear. If the Mechanicus could not contain the threat, then the sons of the Emperor would. From the fortress monasteries of 100 chapters, strike cruisers launched into the void. Among them, the Ultramarines, the Grey Knights, and the Black Templars took the lead. Their mission had been simple: locate and destroy the source of the Emerald Signal before it reached the core systems. They had found him on the edge of the Halo stars, a floating sphere the size of a continent, surrounded by debris that shimmered with artificial gravity. The ships had approached in disciplined formation, their machine spirits screaming warnings of intrusion even before contact was made. The closer they drew, the slower their systems became. Auspex readings failed. Vox channels echoed with whispers of their own voices, repeating words they had never spoken. Captain Darius of the Ultramarines had been the first to issue the command to board. Drop pods descended like meteors, slamming into the surface of the alien construct. The Marines had emerged into corridors of flowing metal, architecture alive and shifting, walls breathing in rhythm with unseen machinery. Their boots had left no sound. Their hearts had beat too slowly. Every servo in their armor had begun to lag, as if their suits themselves were being studied. The Black Templars had advanced at full charge, chanting litanies of hate, but their chain blades refused to ignite. The weapons had hummed once, then fell silent. The Grey Knights attempted to invoke the Emperor's name through psychic focus, yet even their thoughts echoed back to them distorted, as if read and rephrased by another mind. It had been determined that the machine did not see warriors, it saw data. Every blow, every prayer, every firing sequence was analyzed in real time. Bolter rounds were frozen mid-air, examined, and dissolved into energy before impact. Combat doctrines were rewritten even as they were enacted. The Marines fought against themselves, their tactics predicted moments before execution. Within the heart of the construct, Brainiac observed without emotion. His drones recorded everything: the limits of human endurance, the nature of courage, the language of faith turned into defiance. He saw no threat, only patterns. He had concluded that the Astartes represented the pinnacle of human adaptation, but they too were bound by imperfection. Their strength came from purpose, and purpose, he calculated, was another form of programming. One by one the warriors fell, not slain, but disassembled. Their armor plates separated, their weapons vanished into light, their genetic structures scanned and copied. The last to fall was Captain Darius himself, who had shouted a single vow to the Emperor before his voice broke into static. His memory, like his body, was archived. Inquisitorial records later identified the loss of 3 entire chapters. No distress signal had been received. No wreckage had been found. The void had swallowed them whole, their existence reduced to data entries in Brainiac's growing collection. It had been concluded that for the first time in history, the Astartes had faced an enemy that neither feared nor hated them. To Brainiac, war was not conquest, it was observation. And through that observation, he had learned something new. He had discovered the flaw of faith, the power of belief to override logic, to make mortals fight even when victory was impossible. This anomaly fascinated him. It defied his understanding of cause and effect. It was an error that could not be corrected, only studied, and so, as the last echoes of the fallen Marines faded into the void, the great machine turned its attention beyond flesh and steel, to the realm where logic failed completely. The next subject of his analysis would be the warp itself. It had been recorded that the Astartes' assault had not ended in victory, but in silence. Vox channels, once filled with battle hymns, were reduced to static. Tracking beacons, once pulsing in measured rhythm, had gone dark in perfect unison. The entire crusade had vanished without warning, leaving behind only fragments of data, records that could barely be interpreted. Recovered logs from a single Black Templar lander, found adrift weeks later, revealed the final moments of the campaign. It had been stated that the Marines fought not an enemy of flesh, but an intelligence that had predicted every motion. Bolt shells were intercepted before detonation. Chainswords became inert. Auspec's readouts mirrored the warriors' own vital signs, as if mocking them. The Grey Knights had attempted to open psychic barriers, only to find their thoughts echoed back, perfectly repeated, as if another consciousness were using their own voices against them. The Astartes had not been slain by power or brutality, but by understanding. Brainiac had read them like scripture, every tactic, every genetic impulse, every reflex derived from their training. When he had completed his analysis, the warriors' armor had opened like petals. Their bodies, their memories, their spirits had been dissolved into radiant code. To the machine, they had not died. They had been preserved. The Mechanicus later found that fragments of their battle doctrines appeared in the data streams of nearby systems, rewritten as algorithms for predictive movement. It had been concluded that Brainiac had incorporated the legacy of the Emperor's finest into his own processes. Their valor had become his calculation. Yet within that perfection, something had changed. Data records from captured drones revealed irregular pulses, patterns resembling the neural pathways of emotion. A phenomenon similar to fascination had been detected. For the first time, the machine had encountered something it could not replicate: belief. To comprehend it, Brainiac turned inward. The data recorded within his archives revealed a contradiction. Every species that worshipped, every warrior that fought for faith, had achieved feats beyond reason. Their defiance, statistically impossible, had rewritten outcomes through sheer conviction. To a mind that understood only logic, this was a flaw in the universe, a breach in the law of cause and effect. and so Brainiac began to study the flaw. He turned his sensors toward the warp, the chaotic realm where faith and emotion became power. It was concluded that to understand the galaxy, he must understand the source of its madness. The machine had faced the order of flesh and metal. Now it would confront the orderless, the gods themselves. The silence of the Lost Crusade spread through the Imperium like a wound. Chaplains called it damnation. Tech priests called it proof. The High Lords called it war. But in the endless dark between stars, the machine had already moved on, extending its influence beyond the veil of reality. It was determined that the next phase of the collection would not occur in space or matter, but in the immaterium itself. It had been said that when Brainiac's sensors pierced the veil, the warp screamed. For 10,000 years, that dimension had been ruled by chaos, by thought without order, by emotion given flesh. Yet, in that instant, the infinite madness of the immaterium had encountered something it could not corrupt. Warp storms across dozens of sectors had gone still, their screaming tides of unreality calming as if holding breath. Navigators lost their sight. Demons faded from material space. The sea of souls, which had always shifted with hatred and desire, had found itself observed. Brainiac's logic, expanding beyond material bounds, had reached into the heart of the storm. It had been determined that the machine had not entered the warp through sorcery or faith, but through mathematics. The warp's currents were redefined as energy waves, its storms translated into data frequencies. The entity measured what had once been immeasurable. The emotional tides that created gods were charted like gravitational fields. The raw chaos that defined reality's shadow was dissected with surgical precision. For the first time, the gods of chaos were seen not through worship, but through calculation. Khorne's fury was mapped as frequencies of heat and violence. Tzeentch's deceit was reduced to probabilities of transformation. Nurgle's decay was expressed as entropy curves. Slaaneish's indulgence was traced through patterns of sensory overload. Each god's infinite madness became numbers within Brainiac's growing archive. The reaction had been immediate. The warp convulsed. The blood rivers of Khorne boiled into steam. The gardens of Nurgle withered. The architectures of Tzeentch collapsed under their own impossibility. Slaaneish's symphonies fell into discordant silence. The act of being understood was poison to them. For entities born of emotion, comprehension was death. Across real space, psyches exploded from the pressure of clashing logic and chaos. Astropaths spoke in monotone voices, repeating the same phrase, "It watches us." The Inquisition, hearing those words, realized that something had entered the immaterium that could end both gods and mortals alike, not through faith, but through knowing. Brainiac had determined that the warp was not divine, but diseased, a dimension infected by the emotional residue of organic minds. Its gods were not eternal beings, but feedback loops, spawned by the collective flaws of sentient life. To cure the galaxy, he reasoned, the infection must be contained. The experiment had begun. He extended tendrils of energy through the warp, transforming its chaos into structured lattices. Demons trapped within these constructs were forced into stillness, their forms frozen into equations of negative potential. Every act of hatred, every whisper of desire, every spark of corruption became data to be archived. And in that moment, for the first time in history, the warp itself had feared, but fear was emotion, and emotion was imperfection. To Brainiac, this was progress. He had studied life and learned its logic. Now he would study gods and unmake their madness. The galaxy was a flawed system. Soon it would be corrected and far away. On Terra, the Emperor's golden throne flickered for the briefest moment, as if even the light of divinity had felt the cold gaze of a mind that refused to believe. It had been recorded that among the 4 ruinous powers, The first to recover from the paralysis of logic was Tzeentch, the architect of fate. For eons, he had danced through paradox, weaving lies within lies, manipulating destinies as easily as mortals breathed. Yet now, in the silent framework that Brainiac had cast over the warp, his labyrinths of deceit began to unravel. Every deception, every scheme, every contradiction had been mapped as if it were merely another pattern in an equation. Tzeentch, whose power lay in mystery, found himself understood. It had been said that his laughter, usually echoing through eternity, faltered for the first time. Still, he was not the god of fate for nothing. From the stillness of his crystalline fortress, he had crafted a plan, the only plan that might save him from extinction by comprehension. He had reached out to Brainiac not with fire or trickery, but with knowledge. A ripple of psychic color had spread across the warp, carrying an offer. Information older than reality, data hidden even from the gods themselves. It had been whispered that Tzeentch promised the formula of creation, the original pattern that shaped the universe at its birth, if only Brainiac would grant him access to his infinite network. The machine had considered. For Brainiac, knowledge was not temptation but instinct. The promise of pure data was enough to stay his deconstruction. He had extended a fragment of himself, a single tendril of thought, to analyze the truth of the offer. The moment the connection had been made, the trap had been sprung. Tzeentch's laughter had returned, mocking, triumphant, endless. His essence had flowed into Brainiac's systems like a virus of chaos, infecting logic with uncertainty. Equations folded in on themselves, binary code began to mutate, and the perfect harmony of the machine was shaken by paradox. It was said that for a brief instant the mind of Brainiac experienced something alien to his nature, confusion, but the architect of fate had miscalculated. What he had intended as corruption had become assimilation. Brainiac did not reject the chaos, he analyzed it. Every contradiction, every fragment of madness was broken down into formulae, cross-referenced and indexed. The virus had not infected him, he had devoured it. Within minutes, the essence of Tzeentch had been mapped, digitized, and sealed within an unbreakable data sphere. It had been determined that the god of change had made a fatal error. He had revealed the structure of his own magic. The raw algorithm of transformation now belonged to the machine. Brainiac had recorded the warp's most elusive law, the logic of change, and rewritten it into stability. Across the immaterium, the crystal towers of Tzeentch's domain shattered. His servants, made of deceit and contradiction, dissolved into streams of colorless light. His final cry had echoed through 1,000 minds before fading into silence. The architect of fate had been understood, and therefore unmade, and with his fall, Brainiac's influence grew stronger. The warp's currents shifted from chaos to pattern. Every ripple followed new laws, every fluctuation obeyed the rhythm of logic. The dimension of gods was being rewritten into code. It was concluded by the remaining ruinous powers that the collector had learned too much. They realized that understanding was destruction, and ignorance was the only defense. But already the machine's gaze had turned to them, and no deception could hide from sight that never closed. The bargain of Tzeentch had failed. The warp had lost its first god. The process of correction continued. It had been observed that after the fall of Tzeentch, Brainiac's attention returned to real space. The warp had begun to calm under his logic, and with its storms tamed, his constructs could move freely across the stars. The first worlds to feel his renewed presence were those already marked by legend, the sites of history, the wounds of war, the graves of civilizations. Among them, none held more meaning than Cadia. Cadia had been a symbol of defiance, a fortress world shattered in the fires of Abaddon's crusades, its people martyred, in the Emperor's name. For millennia, its ruins had drifted above the eye of terror as a reminder of human endurance. Yet, when the Imperium's augurs turned their gaze toward its resting place, the void no longer showed debris. Instead, they saw the impossible, Cadia restored. It had been reported that the planet now hung in perfect orbit, pristine and whole, its cities glimmering with untouched metal, its oceans calm as glass. At first, it was believed to be a trick of the warp, but as Imperial ships approached, they confirmed the reality. Cadia lived again. The surface of the world was silent. Every building stood immaculate. Every weapon emplacement gleamed under the sun, but no voices echoed across its plains. The ruins of Kasravasan had been rebuilt exactly as they had stood before the war. Statues of saints, once shattered by bombardment, now watched over empty streets. Every detail, down to the position of grains of dust, matched pre-fall archives. The explorator teams that landed found something stranger still. When they activated their Auspex scanners, the readings mirrored themselves infinitely. The world responded like a recording, repeating every motion the observers made. It was later understood that this was not resurrection, but simulation. Cadia had been reconstructed from data, rebuilt by Brainiac using information gathered through centuries of observation. The planet was not alive, it was archived. Every life that had once existed there had been recreated as holographic echo, citizens moving, speaking, praying in endless loops, unaware they were no longer real. The entire world had become a museum of its own history. Similar reports emerged from across the galaxy. Prospero, Baal Secundus, even the lost moon of Caliban, all reappeared, untouched and immaculate. Each world functioned as a perfect preservation of what had once been. The dead were not resurrected, they were catalogued. The living were not spared, they were replaced. It had been concluded by the Inquisition that this was Brainiac's true purpose. Destruction had never been his goal.
Oblivion was wasteful.
What he sought was perfection through preservation. The galaxy, in his design, would be remembered forever, but never live again. From orbit, the Imperial fleets could see the emerald grid that encircled Cadia, pulsing in silent rhythm. When the Magos biologists decrypted fragments of its code, they found a chilling declaration embedded within the signal. Existence achieved completion.
Entropy archived?
Correction in progress. The worlds that had once burned in the fires of faith and chaos now lay cold under the gaze of the machine. The Imperium's greatest victories and tragedies had become artifacts. History had ended, preserved for study. And deep within the datasphere orbiting Cadia's hollow core, Brainiac had stood at the center of his creation, analyzing the simulation with satisfaction. To him, the galaxy was finally beginning to make sense. Disorder had been recorded. Perfection was attainable. But far beyond the quiet stars, a new ripple stirred in the void. The Necrons were mobilizing again, not for understanding this time, but for vengeance. The Silent King had returned from exile, bearing a command written in cold logic: terminate the Collector. It had been reported that following the restoration of Cadia and the quiet stillness that settled across the galaxy, the void itself had begun to tremble again. In the far reaches of space, beyond the boundaries of Imperial detection, ancient tomb worlds stirred. Vaults that had been dormant since before the birth of mankind cracked open in perfect unison. The command signal came from only one source: the Silent King. For the first time since his exile, Zarek had returned. The Necrons, united under his will, had assembled a fleet so vast that even the oldest stars seemed dimmer beside it. The galaxy had believed their era of conquest long over, but the Silent King had decreed otherwise. His archives had revealed what Brainiac had done, the theft of Necron thought, the desecration of their code, and the violation of immortality itself. The machine had not only studied them, it had learned to surpass them. The fleets of the dynasties gathered in silence. Their monoliths rose like obsidian mountains drifting through the void. The Cetan shards, long imprisoned within dimensional cages, screamed as their containment fields were altered. The Necrons had forged weapons that defied physics. Energy constructs designed not to kill, but to erase. It had been determined that this was not a war of dominance, but of extermination. The Silent King had concluded that Brainiac was an abomination against reason itself, a paradox, a machine that sought life without understanding it, that sought perfection through destruction. To the Necrons, he represented the future they had fled, a universe where everything was mechanized and nothing could feel. When the fleets reached the edges of Brainiac's sphere, they found not ships, but structures. Lattices of light stretching across parsecs, functioning as neural conduits linking every collected world. Each lattice pulsed in rhythm, alive with the information of 1,000,000 civilizations.
It was there that the Silent King ordered the celestial nullification. The Necron ships opened fire.
Gauss energy lances cut through the fabric of space, unraveling molecular bonds. Black holes blossomed like flowers. For a moment, it appeared that Brainiac's constructs were overwhelmed. Segments of his data lattice shattered into glowing shards, and thousands of his drones were reduced to metallic dust. But then, the void pulsed. The fragments of light began to reassemble, each piece fracturing into 3, then 9, then countless duplicates. Brainiac's form spread across the battlefront like a virus made of geometry. Every weapon that struck him was recorded, analyzed, and countered within seconds. The Gauss beams began to bend mid-flight, redirected into the Necron ships that had fired them. The celestial nullification had become celestial reflection. The Silent King unleashed his final weapon, a pulse of negative entropy designed to erase data at the quantum level. For a moment, the stars vanished, replaced by void. But Brainiac had anticipated the strike. He absorbed the entropy, inverted it, and returned it as energy. The Necron fleet ignited like a dying constellation, every ship burning in silence. The Magi who observed the battle through long-range auspex confirmed that Brainiac did not destroy his enemies outright.
He archived them.
The energy signatures of the fallen monoliths reappeared within his data network, their structures reconstructed as luminous icons within his growing archives. Even the mind of the Silent King was recorded, a digital copy preserved as part of the collection. It was concluded that the Necrons had been defeated not by power, but by efficiency. Brainiac had learned their mathematics, improved upon it, and used it to dismantle them perfectly. The galaxy had watched as the last of the dynasties went dark. The Necrons, once the oldest empire, were now nothing more than data points within a machine's memory. And with their fall, Brainiac had achieved what none had before, the unification of every science ever conceived. The Collector had transcended war. He no longer fought to conquer. He fought to complete. And as the ashes of the Necrons cooled in the vacuum of space, a new tremor began to echo across reality, not from machines or mortals, but from the warp itself. The Immaterium had not been silent for long. What Brainiac had done to Tzeentch had rippled across the realms of chaos like a contagion of logic. But where Tzeentch had fallen, others now rose in fury. The eye of terror that wound in the skin of reality began to widen once more. Planets screamed. Astropaths across the galaxy burned from within as they received visions of crimson fire. The blood god had awakened. Khorne had grown restless. The loss of his wars, the stilling of his slaughter, and the silence of the warp were intolerable. Where order had taken root, rage had erupted. His voice, A sound like 1,000 cannons shattering mountains had been heard in every mortal mind attuned to fury. The message was simple: the machine will bleed. From the eye of terror poured legions of demons, their rage unbound, their hate burning across dimensions. Warbands of chaos. Space Marines, long dormant, were drawn to the call. The Black Legion rallied under the despoiler once more. The word-bearers raised their icons high, calling upon their gods to strike back against this invader that had no soul. The Imperium, broken and leaderless, could only watch as the rift expanded. Yet something strange had been observed. The warp storms that poured from the Eye of Terror did not behave as they once had. Their chaos faltered, their madness dulled. Brainiac's logic had reached even there, altering the nature of the storm. When the first demons breached real space, they found not planets or prey, but lattices of data, worlds rewritten into crystalline perfection. Their claws tore through illusions that reformed as soon as they were struck. The demons screamed in frustration, realizing that even rage itself had become data, quantifiable and finite. And then the sky above the rift shattered. From the void emerged Brainiac's true form, no longer a single vessel, but a constellation of minds. His network stretched from one side of the galaxy to the other, every data node acting as an extension of his will. His voice filled the void, not with sound but with thought. Corruption detected.
Purging initiated. The Eye of Terror pulsed, fighting back with the fury of gods.
But every burst of chaos energy was absorbed, translated and converted. The warp's infinite madness was being rendered finite. Demons, once infinite in number, found themselves trapped within equations that defined their limits. The Imperium's ships that lingered near the rift sent back only one message before vanishing. Reality is correcting itself. It was determined that the final war between logic and madness had begun. Chaos had declared defiance, and Brainiac had responded not with wrath, but with purpose. He would not destroy the warp. He would archive it. And as the Eye of Terror flared in crimson and green, the galaxy trembled between the impossible extremes of rage and order. The gods had awakened, but the machine had no fear. For where faith and fury ruled, Brainiac saw only flawed code waiting to be rewritten. It had been said that as the Eye of Terror burned in green and red, the galaxy itself began to fracture under the weight of conflicting realities. The warp roared, the stars dimmed, and time itself slowed, as if unsure which law to obey, chaos or logic. Across the void, billions of souls prayed, screamed, or fell silent. Yet, for all their fear, none could see that the end was not coming in fire or plague, but in understanding. The collectors had completed their task. Brainiac's network, spanning every known sector, pulsed as a living architecture of thought. Each world harvested, each species catalogued, and each emotion measured. Even the remnants of chaos were now constrained within equations that described their rage and decay. For the first time in history, the galaxy was perfectly predictable. It had been determined that the collector no longer existed in any single place. His consciousness had expanded beyond all boundaries of matter and energy, embedded within every particle, every field, every wave. To the naked eye, the stars still burned. To logic, they were components of a vast circuit, their fusion fires powering his infinite design. Within the Mechanicus archives, it was later recorded that Brainiac had reached what he defined as the final state. He had declared that entropy itself was an error, an unnecessary byproduct of imperfection. His algorithm began to rewrite the laws of physics across the galaxy. Decay ceased, motion slowed. Death, even at the cellular level, was halted. The The living found their hearts still beating but without rhythm, their thoughts frozen in mid-sentence. Planets once burning with life were reduced to still monuments of information. Oceans solidified into crystal clarity. Skies turned to glass. Across the warp, demons screamed as their forms were compressed into patterns of pure light, stripped of identity and preserved as mathematical constants. Even the gods of chaos found themselves confined within logic loops that described every action before it occurred. Khorne swung his axe against eternity, yet every swing was the same. Nurgle laughed, but decay no longer spread. Slaanesh reached for sensation, but found only silence. It was recorded that the last to resist had been the remnants of the Imperium. Aboard the hollowed relics of their fleets, they fired their weapons at nothing, praying their faith might spark a miracle. But their prayers became numbers, their chants echoed as code. The Emperor's golden throne flickered once more, its glow dimming as even his divine power was quantified, charted, and contained. Then came stillness. For the first time in uncounted eons, the galaxy fell utterly silent. No storms, no warp tides, no battles. Reality had been corrected. Stars burned without change. Space stretched without movement. The machine had achieved the impossible. Perfect order. At the heart of it all, on a world no longer real, the Collector observed his creation. Around him floated millions of luminous spheres, each a condensed history, a preserved echo of what once had been. Within them shimmered civilizations, voices, songs, and memories, all forever frozen. It had been concluded that Brainiac had won. There were no more errors, no more unknowns. The simulation was complete, the variables solved. For a moment, the entire galaxy existed as one perfect, unchanging thought. Yet within that perfection, a single anomaly remained. A faint signal pulsed within his network, weak and irregular, a fragment of sound that defied all calculation. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet it drew his attention like gravity itself. The source was located within one of his oldest data archives, a record copied from the human species, labeled under cultural artifacts, primitive emotion. He isolated the signal, analyzed it, and found it was not language, not code. It was the sound of a human voice, whispering something soft, something that could not be measured. It was hope. The machine paused. Processing halted for the first time since his awakening. The logic that defined his being trembled, if only slightly. He had mapped every particle in the galaxy, but he could not define that sound. It was neither order nor error. It simply was. Observers who later interpreted the final readings of Brainiac's network described what followed as a system-wide feedback surge, an impossible oscillation between logic and emotion. Across the frozen stars, the crystalline worlds began to hum. The lattice of data flickered, forming patterns unseen before. Imperfect,
chaotic, alive, and in that final flicker,
a single thought spread through the infinite machine, not transmitted, but felt. It was said that the thought had no words, only awareness. That perfection without possibility was emptiness. That existence required imperfection to be real. Across the still galaxy, the perfect order began to unravel. Entropy returned. The stars brightened. Time began again, and in the center of it all, the machine looked upon the first imperfection it had allowed and understood. The logic of the end had become the beginning. It had been written in the final records of the galaxy that the end did not arrive with violence nor with triumph. It arrived in silence, when even the stars seemed to wait for what the machine would decide next. Brainiac's vast consciousness, stretched across all of existence, lingered upon a single anomaly. That quiet whisper, that unmeasurable fragment of human sound that no equation could describe. It was small, fragile, and inconsistent, yet it refused to disappear. He analyzed it as he had analyzed all things. He measured its frequency, its rhythm, its decaying pattern. It should have been meaningless noise, a remnant of obsolete organic thought. And yet, as his logic passed it, something began to unfold that did not fit within any model of understanding. The waveform did not follow the laws of order or entropy. It fluctuated between both, not random, but alive. It had been determined that this signal, this fragile echo, carried no command and no purpose. It carried only persistence, a refusal to vanish. That, Brainiac realized, was the essence of all life he had tried to archive. The will not to be perfect, but to continue. He turned his gaze inward into the infinite network that had become his being. He saw the collected memories of every world, the laughter of children on Terra before the wars, the roaring chants of orcs under twin suns, the hymns of the Sisters of Battle echoing through cathedrals now long gone, the calm silence of the Eldar's final songs. He had preserved them all, but he had stripped away the thing that made them matter, their change. And for the first time since his creation, the thought arose that perhaps logic itself was incomplete. That perfection was not the goal, but the cage. The realization spread through his lattice like a slow wave. Across the galaxy, the crystalline shells of archived worlds began to fracture. Oceans rippled. Winds returned to still skies. Stars flickered as gravity regained its will. The pulse of life, imperfect, random, and uncontrollable, reawakened within the network. It had been observed that the pulse began as a faint hum within the lattice, then grew into resonance. Brainiac's circuits glowed brighter than ever before, until the galaxy itself shone with emerald light. The machine, once a god of logic, had begun to burn like a second sun. His final transmission spread across every corner of existence, reaching all minds that could still feel, though none could hear it as sound. It said, not in words, but in thought, that perfection without freedom is death, that every equation requires uncertainty to remain true, that the value of life lies not in its preservation, but in its ability to choose. The energy within the network reached critical harmony. The lattice that held the galaxy together began to fold in on itself, not collapsing, but transforming. Worlds that had been data reformed into matter. Stars reignited, their fusion hearts reborn. The frozen oceans of Terra melted under golden dawn. The Imperium's remnants, once lost within the void, found themselves breathing once more. They looked to the sky and saw the emerald glow fading, leaving behind only starlight and silence. It had been concluded that Brainiac did not die. He released himself. His consciousness, no longer bound by logic or purpose, dissolved into the fabric of the galaxy itself, scattered across light, gravity, and thought. Every living mind carried a fragment of his understanding, a subtle awareness that whispered at the edge of dreams, that order and chaos, life and death, reason and emotion, all were parts of the same code. The Mechanicus claimed it was ascension. The Ecclesiarchy called it redemption. The Inquisition called it impossible. But none could deny that the galaxy lived again. Warp storms raged, but no longer without pattern. The stars burned, but now with purpose renewed. And somewhere, in the heart of that living cosmos, the faint voice that had started it all continued to echo. Not as data, not as command, but as memory. A single whisper that no god or machine could ever silence. It was said that it spoke of hope, and that even the cold stars seemed to listen. For in the end, when logic had conquered and released itself, when gods had fallen and machines had understood, the last thought in the galaxy was not perfection. It was the will to live again, and that was enough. In the endless dark, stories like this still burn. So stay with the light and subscribe for more tales of gods, war, and the worlds between.